In our reading from Romans this morning, we are urged to love one another. These words are no doubt all too familiar to us, but what does it actually mean? What does it actually mean to love your neighbour as yourself? How does it work out in practice? Well, the first thing to note is that the love which is commanded here is primarily an action, not an emotion. Some of you perhaps can't stand your neighbour, but you don't need to worry about that. You're called to love them, not necessarily to like them. So it's primarily an action, not an emotion. It's about what one does for one's neighbours. It's not about any feelings one may or may not have toward them. The point is that we should be as willing to act for a neighbour's good as we are to act for our own good. It has been said that to love your neighbour as yourself is to act with compassion. So let us then take a close look at this term compassion, and all it entails in our contemporary world. Well, for a start, it would appear that compassion is in short supply. Everywhere there's evidence of lack of thought, care and concern for one another and for the planet. And most of us can list the various crises: environmental, ecological, population, north-south divide, east-west divide, urbanization, the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, homelessness, loneliness, suicide rates, violence, terrorism. And you know, not everything can be attributed to the impact of the pandemic. And certainly more knowledge, more resources, and more research are needed to address these various issues. But at the level of will and motivation, it seems clear that something is lacking. And I would suggest to you today that that something is compassion. Now, in general usage, being compassionate means bothering or caring about someone. But this is to reduce and diminish its meaning because it invariably conceals an attitude which can be patronizing and condescending. We talk about taking pity on someone. The preposition on fosters the illusion of distance and separateness. A few more crumbs will be handed out. More resources will be targeted to the weak and vulnerable. But those who are doing the handing out remain untouched and unmoved. Their wealth remains intact. Now, a number of years back, during one particularly cold winter in the UK, a church in Piccadilly, London, opened its doors to the homeless, both young and old, and a rich widow contacted the vicar and said she would ask her staff to send down some soup if that would help. Sometimes apparent compassion can be little more than a private, self-indulgent sentiment brought about by a pang of conscience. Not one of these perceptions of compassion reflects its true meaning, which is clearly summed up by Thomas Merton, who once said that the whole idea of compassion is based on a keen awareness of the interdependence of all living things, which are all part of one another. So words such as interrelatedness, interdependence, and mutuality are all words which express the heart of compassion, from which tenderness towards others, as well as toughness and resistance to injustice, flow. A number of years ago, the photographs which astronauts took of the Earth brought interdependence, interrelatedness, and interconnectedness to life. As one biologist at the time commented, "The Earth is like a simple cell. We should credit it with what it is. For sheer size and perfection and function, it is far and away the grandest collaboration of nature." Compassion should be, and it needs to be, perceived on this global scale, and then it can operate from a bond of shared strength and shared weakness. A compassionate person recognizes that we're all in this world, a global village, together. A compassionate person is one who knows, shares, enters, and tastes, as far as he or she is able, the pain of the other. A compassionate person has an acute awareness of our common heritage, our shared existence with the rest of creation, and of its richness, complexity, and diversity. And this awareness transcends, goes beyond all differences and divisions. Some years ago, a minister in Washington, D.C., invited the city's dozen wealthiest business people to meet and have a meal with a dozen representatives of the poor in inner Washington. As you can imagine, the preparation for this unusual event was difficult. The rich prevaricated. Perhaps in 6 months' time, when their diaries were less full. In any case, most of them already did a lot for the poor, being trustees of various charitable foundations. And the poor, they were suspicious. Were they going to be patronized? And the fixing of the date became an issue. Those representing the poor were not accustomed to fixing meetings 6 months in advance. Now, the purpose of this meal was for the rich to listen to the experiences of the poor. The evening began with much mutual suspicion, in spite of all the preparation that the minister and the team had put into the event. But over time, the atmosphere changed, and by the time everyone had helped to clear the tables and helped with the washing up, much of the earlier suspicion and weariness had evaporated. What happened here at this dinner was simple. As the rich people listened, so they began to see through the eyes of the speakers, something of their dignity, something of their resilience, their anger, their shame, their vitality and their courage. Their humanity called out the beginnings of understanding and respect. And in the weeks and months which followed, some funds were released, expertise and skills were provided, and as a result, schemes for the rehabilitation of homes in inner city Washington and elsewhere were underway. In some cases, mutual trust developed between the parties concerned, and the wealthy became learners. This is a story of how compassion begins to flower. And a feature of that meal together was that by the end of the evening, it had become a celebration. It was not just a question of troubles shared, troubles halved, but of joys shared, joys doubled. The rich who had to listen were able to celebrate their humanity, which they shared with the poor. The wealthy business people recognized a bleakness, a lack of vitality and energy in their own lives, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the pressures to keep on becoming more and more successful and to keep their complex operations under control. But they also noticed the energy, the clarity, the passion, and the vitality of those poor people who told their stories. And for a time in that simple dining room, it might have been said that joy was an appropriate response, because this occasion, this dinner, celebrated the need that each group had for the other. There is no compassion without celebration, whereas by contrast, there is no possibility of celebration when someone at a distance expresses pity for someone else. You know, what angered the authorities and shocked Jesus' contemporaries was the way he ate with the lowlife in Palestinian society, the poor, the beggars, the crippled, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, and the illiterate. At that time especially, sharing food and drink with such people was regarded as highly scandalous. The Greek word for compassion is hardly translatable into English. Hence, we have the awkwardness of the phrase moved to compassion, which we sometimes hear. It means that compassion is a reaction of both the gut and the heart. It means embracing the feeling or situation of another person. To be moved to compassion is to absorb the pain of another. Now, empires or democracies are not organized on the basis of compassion. Therefore, when Jesus showed compassion, he was also making a public stand, a public criticism of all authorities which try to ignore or repress grief, pain, and suffering. It is important for us all. It is important for us all to understand that the Christian emphasis on compassion is to be understood not as a sentiment, not as a feeling, but as an action. in feeding, in sheltering, in clothing, in forgiving, healing, setting free. And such actions invariably are related to justice, putting relationships right, and pursuing the goal of a fair distribution of our resources. In conclusion, compassion is an almost lost but beautiful, powerful, vibrant experience full of possibilities for each one of us. And in the light of the problems facing our society today, and indeed the whole world, it truly offers a way forward.